So welcome everyone to the 2022 National Center for Science Education Friend of Darwin and Friend of the Planet Awards ceremony. For any of you who are not familiar with the National Center for Science Education, we're a nonprofit advocacy group that has been around for 40 years. 2022 is actually our 40th anniversary. And our goal is to ensure that what students learn in their classrooms reflects the best understanding of the science community, in particular about the topics of evolution and climate change, which engender a lot of societal controversy, although they're not scientifically controversial. So we work to ensure that efforts to interfere with how science is taught are monitored, and we work with local activists to block those efforts. You'll hear a little bit about that with some of our awardees today. And we also work directly with teachers to help give them the skills and the confidence and the content knowledge that they need to teach evolution and climate change, even in places where that they might have a reasonable fear of conflict because of lack of acceptance of those topics in their communities. During the pandemic, when I think it became clear to everyone that Americans' understanding of how science works was maybe leaving a bit to be desired, we developed a curriculum set of lessons on the nature of science, which we are also now making available to teachers and providing professional development on, in the hopes that we can contribute to a generation of citizens who are able to understand how science works and thereby be inoculated against misinformation and be more likely to be able to take evidence into account when they're making decisions about their own lives and about their lives as citizens. So that's NCSE in a nutshell. And we have 5 of our 6 awardees here today, and I just want to give you a little introduction about Kelly Lee, who was not able to join us today, who was one of our climate change Friend of the Planet winners. Kelly is a former classroom science teacher. She now directs the science project at the University of California, Irvine. She's the author of Teaching Climate Change for grades 6 to 12, Empowering Science Teachers to Take on the Climate Crisis through NGSS, which stands for the Next Generation Science Standards. And this is perhaps the most practical guide on teaching climate change that has, for teachers, that has been published yet. So we're sorry Kelly couldn't be here, but she is one of the people, like the other awardees, who help NCSE achieve its mission, which if we define it as making sure that every single science teacher in the country is doing a good job teaching these topics, becomes abundantly clear that's not something that we can do on our own. And so every year we like to reach out and recognize people who are making our job easier, making our burden lighter, and spreading climate change and evolution education into places where we can't, where we're not connected. So we have 6 awardees this year. 5 of them are with us. And the Deputy Director of the National Center for Science Education, who also directs all of our efforts to monitor and push back on efforts to challenge the integrity of the science classroom, Glenn Branch, is going to introduce our first awardee. Glenn?
Thank you, Anne. Lisa White is the Director of Education and Outreach at the University of California Museum of Paleontology, having previously been Professor of Geosciences at San Francisco State University. She's a Fellow of the Geological Society of America and the California Academy of Sciences. She is active in promoting diversity efforts in the geosciences community, and she recently received the coveted Stephen J. Gould Award from the Society for the Study of Evolution, so she's on a roll. At UCMP, her important accomplishments include spearheading the invaluable Understanding Evolution website, on which NCSE was a partner, and the similar Understanding Science website. Lisa, would you like to say a few words?
Yes, excuse me. Thank you so much for that introduction, Glenn. And I'm just so grateful for the long history that UCMP and NCSE have together. And of course, none of the work that we do would be possible without the terrific staff, in particular Anna Thanukos, who's the primary editor of understanding evolution and understanding science. And I just try to extend the good work of our team at UCMP, and just wanting to reach even greater and more diverse audiences. So thank you so much.
No, we really appreciate you, Lisa. Lisa and I have worked together closely, not so much since the pandemic started, but we'll have to get together again soon. I've just been told that one of our board members, whose name will be familiar to all of you, has joined us, and I want to hand the microphone over to Michael Mann for a brief introduction.
Oh, thanks very much. Thanks, Anne. Can everybody hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yeah, okay, great. Again, thanks, Anne, and hello, everyone. I'm very pleased to be representing NCSE's Board of Directors at this event, especially because it gives me a chance to see the upshot of one of the board's decisions in person. For decades, NCSE has conferred its Friend of Darwin Award to select individuals or organizations whose efforts to support NCSE and advance its goals with regard to evolution education. Friends of Darwin have ranged from eminent scientists and scholars to ordinary citizens. Well, no, strike that, extraordinary citizens, who have stood up to attempts to inject creationist pseudoscience or remove evolution from the public schools, something I'm sadly very familiar with living in Pennsylvania. And for years now, NCSE has conferred a Friend of the Planet Award to people and groups who have made significant contributions to NCSE and the cause of climate education. Let me just brag that I was one of the inaugural Friends of the Planet back in 2014, so I've got one of those lovely blue donuts on my shelf too. And ironically, the condo I live in now in Philadelphia looks right out onto the Academy of Natural Sciences, where I received that award. It wasn't until I joined NCSE's Board of Directors in 2019, though, that I learned how the recipients of these prestigious awards were selected. I guess that I really hadn't thought much about it before. Were there supercomputers solving complex nonlinear systems of equations, or was it a more primal process involving the casting of oracular bones in firelit caves? Disappointingly, it was neither. Instead, NCSE's staff compiles a long list and then makes a recommendation to the board. I've got to say, these recommendations have consistently been excellent. NCSE's staff has its finger on the pulse of so many issues involving science education across the country and even around the world. So they have a great sense of who's making important contributions and who deserves these honors. So it wasn't a surprise to me at the NCSE board meeting in April 2021 that the staff came up with a stellar slate of recommendations, or that my fellow members of the board and I swiftly agreed that this was a group that amply deserved to be honored for their sustained, diverse, and effective efforts to support science education. This year's recipient of the Friend of the Planet Award, Andy Dessler, is a colleague and friend who's been right there with us on the front lines of the communication battle for decades now, and he couldn't be more deserving of this award. But don't take my word for it. Anne and NCSE's Deputy Director, Glenn Branch, will take turns briefly introducing each of the recipients, who will then have the chance to offer a few remarks.
So we skipped ahead, and Glenn has already introduced Lisa White, and now it's my turn to introduce the already mentioned Andrew Dessler. Andy is a climate scientist at Texas A&M University. He specialized for 2 decades in global climate physics with the goal of understanding how feedbacks within the atmosphere affect climate and how to test and improve the accuracy and validity of climate models, which I must say is something that we focus on in one of our climate lessons, since one of the principal misconceptions about climate models is that models will tell you whatever you want, and so they're not worth listening to, which of course is not how climate modeling works. So this is a academic topic that's near and dear to our hearts. But more recently, Andy has shifted his focus to the intersection of climate change and human society, which I would argue is a system that is vastly more complicated even than the atmosphere. And this shift was partially inspired by a year that he spent as a policy analyst in the Office of Science and Technology Policy in Washington, D.C., in the belly of the beast, as it were. Andy has written a textbook, The Introduction to Modern Climate Change, and co-authored another book, The Science and Politics of Global Climate Change, which is in its third edition. He also regularly engages in outreach to the public. He writes op-eds in Texas and national publications, recently including a piece in the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientist and Rolling Stone, so covering the waterfront there. He's been enormously helpful to NCSC, specifically, most recently, in our battles over how climate change is treated in Texas's state science standards. Andy?
Thank you, Anne, and thank you, NCSC, so much for this incredible honor. I'm truly humbled to be receiving this award, particularly since the previous winners include so many climate communicators I deeply admire, like Mike Mann. Climate change is an issue that affects everyone alive today, as well as future generations. And like many of you, I'm committed to raising awareness about the urgent need to address it. Also, like many of you, I started out avoiding direct interactions with the deeply dismissive, as the Six America survey describes them, or what might less charitably be described as climate deniers. But as an experiment, I've tried engaging them in the last year or so, such as engaging people like Joe Rogan. These people don't hear directly from climate scientists very often, and I think we have a good and optimistic message about the revolution in renewable energy that's currently going on. So I thought, what the heck, let's give it a try. In these efforts, I'm not trying to persuade all of the dismissives. That would be impossible. But if I can introduce a seed of reality into a few % of the audience, then I'll take it. Is it working? I don't know, but it's not working. So I'm going to keep it up. And I appreciate NCSC's acknowledgement of these efforts, which can be a lot harder than talking to a friendly audience who's already concerned about climate. And I would also like to thank everyone else who's out there talking about climate. My mental model of climate communication is like rain eroding a mountain. Each individual raindrop doesn't do much, but all the raindrops working together over a long time can wear down the mountain of denial. I'm just a raindrop. I can't do this alone, and neither can you. So thank you for everyone working with me to move the dialogue forward. So again, thank you to NCSC for this award. I'm grateful for the recognition. I will continue to do my part to try to raise awareness about the importance of climate action.
Thanks for those inspiring words, Andy. Let me now introduce Tim M. Berra, who is Professor Emeritus of Evolution, Ecology, and Organismal Biology at The Ohio State University. A distinguished ichthyologist, he also wrote one of the most accessible rebuttals of creationism from a generation ago, Evolution and the Myth of Creationism, and has more recently turned to Darwin scholarship with the brief biography, Charles Darwin, The Concise Story of an Extraordinary Man, and a family study, Darwin and His Children, His Other Legacy. Tim is a longtime NCSC member who has consistently aided NCSC's efforts in Ohio, which fortunately have not been needed as much recently as they were 15 years ago. Tim?
Thanks, Glenn. I really appreciate this award. And when I look back at the other awardees from the past, I'm very impressed with this list of scientists, educators, and authors, because I own most of their works. They're all around me. I've got a 5,000 volume personal library, and virtually everybody on the past list is included. It's a really good feeling to have one's life's work recognized and appreciated. On the other hand, and there's always another hand, it's frustrating to see that the same people who lied about evolution are also lying about climate change and vaccinations and election results and knowledge in general. It's a bit frustrating to realize that our job will never be done. We'll never get to the end of what we're trying to do. It's in a way like when I go to the gym. I've been going to the gym for 50 years. When does that finish? When can I not stop going to the gym? Well, the same thing happens with what we're trying to do. We will never finish it. But who knows how bad things would be if we weren't doing it in the first place. Now, some of my more waggish colleagues at Ohio State University insist on referring to the Friend of Darwin Award as a Darwin Award. And they know what they're doing. It's deliberate. They're trying to pull my chain. The Darwin Award is given to people who supposedly improve the human gene pool by removing themselves from it in a spectacularly stupid manner. It's not enough to have merely killed oneself. You have to be proud of it to get the Darwin Award. I'm reminded of Groucho Marx's remark when he got the letter from the Friars Club saying that he was admitted as a member. And he says, I don't want to belong to any club that would have me as one of the members. Well, that's not true with this. I am so pleased to have this award. Finally, in the words of that great American philosopher and my cousin, Yogi Berra, I want to thank all of those who made tonight necessary. Cheers.
Thank you. That's a hard act to follow. And isn't it the United States University? Aren't you contractually obligated to say it that way? I'm just checking.
Well, yes, as a matter of fact, we're told all our papers have to be the Ohio State University. That is technically and legally part of our name.
Yes, that's what I hear. So,
A lot of people think it's just arrogance, but then we have a pretty good reason to be arrogant.
If you do say so yourself. All right, I am happy to now introduce Jenny Park, who is here representing Climate One. She is the managing director of Climate One. And so the Friend of Darwin and Friend of the Planet Awards sometimes go to an organization instead of an individual, and that's the case here. Climate One is a weekly podcast and public radio program from the Commonwealth Club, and I'm going to read its own description of itself because it's better than anything I could write. It engages advocates, influencers, and policymakers in empowering conversations that connect all aspects of the climate emergency, the individual and the systemic, the scary and the exciting, to deepen your understanding of the most critical issue of our time. Climate One also presents the Stephen H. Schneider Award for Outstanding Climate Education. So to me, the most important word in that description of Climate One is conversation. Climate One is distinctive in its focus on ensuring that communication about climate change includes genuine conversation among all the many publics that have a stake in our climate and our future. I know how adept they are at generating a really productive and informative conversation. I have participated in their program myself, as have several other people connected with NCSC, including my predecessor as executive director, Eugenie Scott, a board member, Naomi Oreskes, board member, Michael Mann, who you just heard from, and another board member, Ben Santer. Jenny, thank you for everything that you do to make Climate One such a vital part of the climate change conversation.
Thank you, Anne. You put it so beautifully.
Oh, it was your words.
But yeah, like you said, we are a team. I'm here accepting this award on behalf of everyone on the Climate One team. And that includes Greg Dalton, Brad Marshland, Austin Colon, Ariana Brocious, Megan Basilia, and Sarah Catherine Coxon. We are so honored to be called a friend of the planet and included in this real academic powerhouse. And if I'm being a little bit honest, I think I'm a little embarrassed to be bringing down the PhD per capita in this room. So I'm feeling my mom's voice in my ear when she was telling me, you should go to grad school. But that being said, a key tenet that really drives the work the Climate One team does every week is this notion that addressing the climate starts by talking about it. And some critics may say talk is cheap. And one could say that that is a fair argument, especially when that talk doesn't get followed by walking the walk. But the climate crisis is a massive problem, and nobody's going to be able to solve it on their own. It's going to take everybody jumping in the boat, grabbing an oar, and starting to row in the right direction. So we have to start with that moment of like, that's interesting. Tell me more about it. And there are a lot of reasons why people are hesitant to talk about climate change, right? They might feel a little insecure, like they don't know enough about it, or they're not expert enough. They might fear the fear of conflict because it might be someone that's on the other side of the political aisle, or there's this ideological divide that seems impossible to bridge. They may also feel daunted by the scope of the problem. Climate grief is real. So the paralysis that we feel when we get overcome by all of these losses and the tragedies that we suffer during wildfires and floods, that's very real. And others might just feel like, oh, climate just isn't my thing. I'm not in the STEM field. I'm not an engineer. I'm not a scientist. So there's not really a seat for me at the climate table. So all of these reasons are why Climate One dives into not just the technical stuff. I mean, the EVs and the heat pumps and all the things are very important. And we do talk about those, but we also aren't afraid to wade into like the emotional stuff because like I said, this is a huge, huge problem. It's going to take everybody on board to solve this problem. And we're going to need to keep all of our emotional batteries charged. So thank you for this award. It helps us it gives us a little bit of a jolt into like the Climate One team's emotional battery, and congratulations to our fellow awardees.
Thank you, Jenny, and thank you to all your colleagues at Climate One as well. A historian of American education at Binghamton University, Adam Lotz specializes in understanding conservative thought and action on education, which of course overlaps with the creationism evolution controversy. His books include Fundamentalism and Education in the Scopes Era, God, Darwin, and the Roots of America's Culture Wars, Teaching Evolution in a Creation Nation, co-authored with the philosopher Harvey Siegel, and most recently, Creationism USA, Bridging the Impasse on Teaching Evolution. He's also a prolific author of op-eds and the like about conservative attacks on public science education, offering sensible and informed commentary, by which I mean commentary that I agree with, of course. Adam.
Thanks very much. And I need to especially thank Glenn in particular. He, over the years, has helped with his vast knowledge of all things creationism, now and in the past, has shared a lot of his time so generously with me to help me understand these questions about American creationism now and in the past. And of course, I'd like to thank the whole NCSE for being included. It's a huge honor. I've been a follower of the work for so long that it's it feels very wonderful to be included. So thank you. I should also say, though, like Jenny, I do feel like something of a poser. I'm not a scientist. I'm not even a science educator. I don't even write specifically about the history of science in close focus. But I think the interest for me in creationism and the history of evolution education is partly in testament to what the NCSE does and the importance of it. I'm interested in schools as a whole, in society as a whole. And it seems to me that what the NCSE does so well is nothing less than, fighting for good values and truth in American society as a whole. So I think you can't overstate the importance of the mission of the organization. And so to echo what Dr. Barra said, it's not just creationism or climate denialism. It's talk about ivermectin and injecting bleach. It's a fight over, what counts as good and who counts as an authority and what counts as science. So it's tempting, I think, to think of all these things as new, but the NCSE has shown that these fights have been around for a good time, a good long while, and they really are fights for America itself. So I really can't say enough about how honored I feel to be included in this group, because I've been such an admirer of the work of so many of the people at the NCSE and its associates for so long. So thank you very much.
Thank you. We have time now for some questions, and these have been submitted by people who are probably in the audience now. We have usually paraphrased them a little bit, so don't be surprised if you hear your question come out slightly different from me. But I'd like to start with Lisa. Lisa, the resources, the Understanding Science website, the Understanding evolution websites have been enormously helpful to NCSE, and they are mentioned by so many of the teachers that I meet in my travels. I also now have Understanding Global Change, and I wonder if you have any plans for additional websites along those lines and what the topics might be.
Well, we so appreciate all of the users of those sites. And what we decided to do this last year or two is we've refreshed the site. So Understanding Evolution and Understanding Science have a new look. Understanding Evolution is nearly 15 years old. And so there were both some back-end improvements that were needed, as well as some front-facing changes that make it easier to search for information. We have all sorts of data-rich resources and more profiles on scientists, a diversity of scientists who specialize in evolution that we think is especially important, to show young people who the scientists are that do that amazing work. But I also want to mention in answer to the question that we will be celebrating the 30th anniversary of UCMP having a web presence. So I know it's hard to even think of a time when we didn't have ready access to information on the web. But in '93, when the web was in its infancy, UCMP was one of the first 100 websites anywhere in the world. And I believe we were the first to put a dinosaur on the web, and other fossils, but we've been digging back through those older web pages, which do show their age, but there's some great resources there on the fossil record of deep time, on biomes, and rich examples of biodiversity. And so we want to refresh some of those older web pages so that they just continue to be useful for folks.
That's great. They are really wonderful, really, really helpful. Let's move on to Andy. So as a native Texan, you must have some mixed feelings about climate change education in your home state. How do you think the state is doing when it comes to climate change education, and what can we do about making it better?
Yeah, well, I think that's a good question. My kids are seniors in high school right now. And in fact, I was saying, oh, you should take environmental science. It turns out their high school didn't even have it we couldn't quite get a good answer from them about why they weren't offering that AP environmental science class. But the problem is it's not just a problem with climate change, it's a problem with democracy and about getting the right people elected to the school boards and making sure those people's voices are heard, because really, the kids care about climate change. They should care about climate change, and they've got skin in the game that those of us that are a bit older may not have as much skin in the game. And so I think it's crucially important that we really wrest control for reality and teach that to the kids.
Yeah, thank you. So shocking, no AP environmental science, although that's
I just say thanks to NCSE. I've been in I've responded to a lot of requests from you guys over the years about the climate standards in Texas textbooks. So I really appreciate you guys being there in Austin, because I don't know how to fight those battles. So thank you.
Yeah, sadly, we learned how to do it with evolution, and a lot of the same principles apply, but we can't do it without the local people, to help. It can be actually counterproductive for us to waltz in from, the Bay Area, Pelosi land, and say, hey, you should do this with your standards. So it helps to have people who have local credibility. So thank you for doing that for us. I have a question for Tim here. So you've written a lot about creationism. You've written a lot about the life and work of Charles Darwin. So I'm going to ask you to channel your inner Darwin and tell us what he would say to today's creationists.
Well, remember, Charles started off as one. He studied to be a clergyman in the Church of England. He bought into the creationist ideas of the time. It was only after he had the experiences on the Beagle for 5 years, visiting jungles and islands and all the excitement of that, that he actually learned some things. And he realized that figuring things out was better than making things up. Now, he was a very much a gentleman. He was a good guy, a nice person. I'm not sure he could deal with today's fundamentalists, basically. We use these euphemisms of saying anything but fundamentalists, but that's what they really are. Evangelicals or creation, they're fundamentalists. And he used to find confrontations made him sick. Even simple little things of dinner conversation, he'd have to leave and go up to his bedroom for 3 years with digestive problems. You know, I'm not sure how he would deal with these people. I think he would, you know, he would try and explain in a reasonable way and then say, I can't get to them. And that's not really the answer you want to hear, but that's sort of what I think he would do. One of the reasons I turned to writing about Darwin's children and giving lectures about Darwin's life was that was a non-confrontational way of working evolution into the topics people were interested in about the life of a human, of a man who was famous. You could say things in explaining their life that taught about evolution. And it seemed to be less confrontational than merely trying to drum in facts. So by putting those things together, that's an approach I've taken, but I'm not at all satisfied or happy with the progress we have made. It's, as I said in the beginning, this is never going to end. We do some good and we make little advances, but sooner or later we end up starting all over with the same crackpot ideas and trying to bash them down. So that's my rather sanguine version of this.
Well, I think it's interesting that you say that Darwin would have had a hard time talking to people, would have grown frustrated talking to people who were not willing to look at new evidence and change their minds. I think that is not at all an uncommon attitude among academic experts and every single person on Twitter. So Darwin's in good company there. Jenny, so you have been in the position to witness so many of these conversations with so many different kinds of people who are involved in the climate crisis in one way or another. Do you have some memorable moments you can share that happened at a Climate One event? And no one is going to hear about this. It's just going out to the whole web. So you can say whatever you want.
Well, I have a fresh memory actually just off of an event that we had last night. It was about the arts and environmental justice and activism. And what really stood out to me was looking at the guests on stage and the audience that came to the Commonwealth Club to see the speakers, listen to them talk. And I think a lot of us have this notion that, oh, climate change, a lot of the people are working on it are largely white, they're largely wealthy, they're very educated. And I looked around the room and like the picture told such a different story. There were a lot of young folks out from San Francisco State. There were a lot of artists. There were tons of people of color. And it was one of those moments where like I really felt like the face of the climate change activism is really changing. And in order for us to figure our way out of climate change, thriving on the other side, like it's going to take everybody. We can't afford to leave people behind. So that was like a very heartfelt moment of like, okay, things are changing. We are having important conversations. We have the right people in the room.
That is a wonderful answer. I mean, I was hoping for a wardrobe malfunction, but that was a really great answer. Adam, so someone wants to know whether you get a lot of feedback from creationists on your work.
I do. I have. In fact, I even had to set up a separate Cremail folder on my email to store it all. And the thing that I find heartening is that almost without exception, not without exception, but almost without exception, it's very friendly and open and interested in talking about issues. A lot of times it has it shows me the disjunction. People will try to lay Bible verses on me to convince me, and it shows how there's a gap in our ability to talk about some issues, because no Bible verse is going to convince me. And I think similarly, in some ways, as Dr. Barra was saying, no amount of Darwin's reasonable evidence-based facts will convince some of them.
Yeah, that's right. I know we'll get, I have another question for you about being a teacher, but we work with lots and lots of teachers, and they not infrequently have students come into their classrooms who already have very strong feelings about evolution or about climate change, and the teachers have to learn to navigate that. And they have a whole year to have that long conversation and to provide lots of examples of how science works from outside of evolution and climate change. We and many others advocate for emphasizing the nature of science. That's why we've developed a unit on it now, because that's some background information that when you get to the topics where students might come in with these big heartfelt misconceptions, having started off with the nature of science can be really, really helpful on that. But what I've also heard often from teachers is those students who are the most passionate about their position when they come into class are often the ones who have the biggest aha moment when they start to realize how science works, and that it doesn't necessarily mean that they have to abandon their faith. So I think you probably see that in your emails too, that this is not, it's not pig-headedness. It's really so emotionally deep. And so learning to have conversations with people that understand that and respect that, I think is really important. Lisa, I have another question for you. This was from a teacher, and she says, in my district, evolution doesn't appear explicitly until the third marking period, but it's totally relevant to the first two topics. And then she says, bless her heart, given, I'm assuming it's a her, that's just statistics, could be a man, but most biology teachers are women. Given Dobzhansky's observation that nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution, she asks, doesn't it make sense to weave evolution concepts into all biology topics?
Absolutely. So share and teach evolution early and often. And on the one hand, I can understand why in some curriculum planning that it does come, midway or towards the end, or after students maybe have more opportunities to learn content and maybe are better able to grasp some of the specific examples of evolution in the plant and animal record. But connecting back to our Understanding Evolution website, one of the reasons we designed it in the way that we did, with rich resources, with portals where one can start with Evolution 101 or get ideas for both teaching and learning evolution, is there are ways to incorporate the topic really anywhere. And if teachers need an example or a last minute way to show at any point in a biology course how evolution works, and some of the ways in which it's evident around us every day, then with a few clicks they certainly have the kind of resources and information to do just that in a course. So not to completely work around what might be prescribed in a curriculum plan, but we do really value the way that we share the resources on the site to just make it easy for educators to incorporate, good teaching and learning and evolution at really any point in the class.
That's great. Okay, so whoever asked that question, you heard it from Dr. White. Go ahead and put evolution in there. And if you need some help, go to Understanding Evolution and you'll find some ideas. Andy, this is another kind of teacher style question. How can we teach that carbon dioxide, which is invisible to the naked eye and measured in amounts of parts per million, is actually capable of changing the entire Earth? How can we convey that a change from a few hundred parts per million to a few hundred more can again have this kind of huge impact? How do we help learners? And I think that this is not just students in school, but anybody that we talk to. How can we help them understand that these amounts that seem so small, maybe so trivial, are actually so consequential?
Right. So, I think it's important to understand that physics is full of things that don't make sense, whether it's quantum mechanics or, torque on a gyroscope. There are lots of things. It's like, oh, that's weird. And in general, people understand them. The real challenge with climate science is not it's not anything about the science. It's really about the implications of the science and the implications of their worldview. And so I think, as has been mentioned previously, the real challenge is to convince people that you can believe this and it doesn't, invalidate everything you believe in. There are, this is part of a consistent worldview, and it's not going to challenge the things you believe in. I also would add that I think it's very important that everyone understand how science works. So in my classes, I spend at least a week going over peer review, assessment processes, how science develops knowledge. And I think, those are really the key things. You can't just give people a fact that they don't want to hear and expect them to believe it. You really have to give them the tools for them to understand why it's believable and why accepting that is not going to cause, their entire worldview to collapse.
Yeah, very, very important. In fact, I'm going to say this is a question from me, for you and for Michael Mann, because I've been writing about scientific consensus for general audiences, for teachers, and talking about, when you can, fairly say that there's a scientific consensus about something. And maybe this is my question for you. Does any other area of science put the immense amount of effort into working together to decide what the consensus is, to every 5 years with the IPCC process to say, this is what we know so far, and this is how confident in it we are, which provides the tool for policymakers and everybody else? Does any other area of science put so much effort into working out what its consensus is?
I would say that other fields don't write reports, but consensus is the cornerstone of science. And you can't do science if you don't understand what all of your colleagues think is, how do you come up with an interesting question? My father, who I think may actually be on this call, used to always say, the key thing about being a good scientist is asking good questions. You can't ask a good question if you don't know what the consensus is, what people accept and what they don't accept, and so every scientist is always reading the papers, talking to colleagues, trying to figure out what the consensus is. The difference is they don't write documents about it. I think that's really the key thing. So climate science is unique in the sense that we document what the consensus is. And I hats off to the IPCC. I think they do a fantastic job.
Mike, do you have anything to add to that?
Oh, I would, echo everything that Andrew said there. And, the importance, I would emphasize once again, of explaining the process of how science works. It's so critical. It's the old adage, you give a person a fish, you feed them for a day, you teach them how to fish, you feed them for a life. And that's what we're doing. We're teaching them how to think scientifically. When it comes to climate science in particular, is there any other area of science where there has been such exhaustive, constant assessments? The National Academy of Sciences, the IPCC, the U.S. U.S. climate assessments. I think that there are some parallels probably in medical science. I think in certain areas of medical science, cancer, where, you know, our knowledge is not only constantly evolving, but it's really important to establish on a constant basis what our state of knowledge is, because we have to make really important decisions in the face of uncertainty. So I think there are parallels in other areas. I would imagine that, you know, the controversy, the fact that climate change is a threat to powerful vested interests, has forced the scientific community to sort of bend over backwards in sort of the degree of assessments that we do, the exhaustive nature and the openness of those assessments. And I think Andy can attest to this as well. We're often criticized, the climate science community is criticized as being too insular and not open to criticism, but just the opposite is true. If you look at the IPCC process, it's as open as a process possibly could be to criticism, to the give and take, and the formation of consensus, and the recognition of areas where there isn't consensus, where there is a divergence of opinion. The IPCC process embraces all of that. And I don't know, maybe Andy has some additional thoughts there.
No, I think that's exactly right. You know, it's understanding the process, and I think climate science. You know, we've spent decades responding to these arguments from people like Dick Lindzen. You know, the very small number of credible scientists who raise objections. It's amazing the amount of effort that's gone into addressing them. I see Ben Santer is on in the audience. You know, Ben spent a lot of time responding to people about detection attribution. And you know, it's as a scientist, you're interested in good arguments, and so we respond to them. And you know, it just so happens that today there really aren't any good arguments left, so we don't spend a lot of time responding to the really terrible arguments. You know, we've moved on. You know, we don't want to argue whether the Earth's warming or not.
Yeah, I think it's really it's incredibly helpful as a teaching tool to point out the efforts that the climate science community goes to define, you know, what are the open questions and what are the questions that are effectively settled. That's something that you know, it's a misconception that lots and lots of students have about science, that it's either true or it's not true. And this idea that really the cutting edge of science is the uncertainty, but that doesn't mean everything is completely, you know, up in the air. So thank you for indulging my question, and I'll go back to the questions from the audience now. This one is for Tim. So you mentioned this before, but you wrote a whole book about Darwin's children, and that struck this questioner as unusual, since biographies of the children of a major figure, especially scientists, must be very rare. So why were you interested, and why would a reader be interested in learning about Darwin's children?
Well, the book grew out of my first concise biography of Darwin, when I, of course, became aware that he had 10 children with Emma Wedgwood. And in looking for another project, it interested me. I wanted to know, who were these people and what did they do? Were they significant? And by doing that, I learned a lot about Darwin himself. He was a really, really good father. He's sort of the poster father of Father's Day, I would think. His children were not forced to become anything. They were a wealthy family. They could do what they want. But when they indicated they were interested in something, Charles made it possible for them to really explore it. For example, his son George was interested in astronomy, and Charles made sure that he got enrolled in a grammar school that had an observatory. And George Darwin ends up becoming the dominant astronomer of the world for 50 years and a great mathematician. His son Horace was a tinkerer. He made things and shaped things, and Charles got him a lathe and various tools for the house. Horace went on to form the Cambridge Scientific Instrument Company. Both George and Horace were fellows of the Royal Society and were knighted. Leonard Darwin was interested in photography. And in the very early days, it was almost impossible to get chemicals and so forth. Well, Charles created a dark room in their home, and Leonard was given all he needed to practice and learn photography. He ended up doing this in his Army career by photographing transits of Venus and on the other side of the Earth. He took a lot of pictures of the Darwin family. This was all basically encouragement from childhood, from Charles. Francis Darwin was another one of the Darwin boys who was a fellow of the Royal Society and was knighted. He worked right next to Charles on plants. He would draw specimens for him. They would collaborate on papers and books. This was just an extraordinary family. So that got me to learn more about Darwin, the man, as well as just general information of Victorian times and human history. So I'm really glad I did that. I had no idea how that book would turn out, but it was a lot of fun to do, and I'm happy with it.
Oh gosh, it sounds like it would be interesting to anybody. And I'm sort of pleased and surprised to hear that there was possibly a group of 12 people who were nerdier than the NCSE staff. That's shocking. I have another question for Jenny. The Climate One, apparently now intends to set the stage for one-time adversaries to develop empathy and perhaps become partners who develop solutions that inspire us all. That's up on your website. Tell us more. How do you plan to do that?
Well, I feel like it's something that the Climate One team has been doing for a long time now, but it's become more pronounced because we're now living in a world where everything, not just climate change, but like even our choice of socks can become a polarized issue, right? One example that Greg talks about is back before the pandemic, when we used to do a lot of live events together, he would do this thing where he would take the guest out and go to dinner after the event and kind of talk and break bread together at a table. And there was one event where there was an executive director at an environmental NGO and an oil executive that really kind of sat down at dinner. And it's safe to say that they didn't leave dinner, holding hands, singing Kumbaya together. But there was a very palpable sense that people saw each other as human beings. They saw each other as this person who has a bunch of shareholders to answer to. And, he saw her as like, she's a woman of color who has a deep commitment to standing for Indigenous people in the Amazon. So it's like, there's a sense that we don't have to agree on everything, but we have to understand where we're coming from. And that's also exemplified in a pretty recent event that we had. It was one of the few first events that we've had in person since the pandemic, which is super exciting. But it was an event with John Gable, who is a founder of allsides.com. He represents more of the conservative side. And we had Joan Blades, who of course is a co-founder of MoveOn.org, and she's now with livingroomconversations.org. But there's a very common thread that came out of that discussion too, is to lead with relationships and with empathy. Because if a flood or a hurricane or a wildfire is hitting someone, their first instinct isn't to talk about, well, climate change causes because it's doing this to the atmosphere and all those things. Like, they want to be taken care and seen as a human being who might need shelter and food and help. So when we lead with that empathy, see where people are coming from, and we invest in those relationships, we can have really long, deep, and hard conversations about climate.
Yeah, that's fantastic. I really look forward to seeing who you bring together, because starting those conversations really is, it's the only way to start building some common ground. And that's a great lead into the last question we have time for today, which is for Adam. And this is a nice way to wrap up everything, including what NCSE does. Mentioned before that teachers, they take the kids who come into their class, and those kids could be coming from a lot of different places. So you taught in middle school and high school for a decade before you entered higher education and academia. So how have your experience as a teacher influenced your work in academia?
Yeah, it's driven the whole thing. And you said before, as we started, the issues that we're talking about, science, climate change, they're not controversial in scientific terms. but they are controversial in other ways. And when I started doing my doctoral work, I was still teaching high school, and I was curious why is it that schools work that way? Why do they? Why is there such a low bar in a lot of schools, so that if anyone can tar any idea with a smidge of contrived controversy, schools will tend to avoid it. And schools tend to kind of, there's a lot of awesome, smart, brave teachers out there and students and families, and yet schools overall, not all, but overall, tend to sort of avoid things that are considered controversial by anyone, which is a lot of ideas. It doesn't have to be actually controversial to be considered controversial by someone. So that question as a classroom teacher spurred me on, but also my work as a teacher gives me two huge reasons for not just hope, but I've seen the proof, which is thing number one. It's no parent wants a low quality education for their kid. So once in my experience, if a parent has a question about, I taught history and English. If they have a question about a book you're assigning, or how you're teaching students about the Vietnam War, or anything, which can be controversial issues, once we talk about it and they meet me and they see what the students are doing, they say, yeah, I want my student to have a high quality education, including an exposure to ideas that are tricky and difficult. The key, though, is something else that I take hope from and optimism from, is the key there is trust. Parents don't want to just give their kid to a stereotype that they saw on the news of what they think teachers are doing to their children. And they're out there. They're really horrible accusations about what teachers are doing. And real life teachers aren't doing that. And real life parents know that their kids' teachers are there not for the money. They're there because they care about ideas, they care about the children, and everybody at the table, the parents, the teachers, the students, they want to know, and they want a high quality education. As Jenny was saying, with empathy for climate events, same thing with school. When there's trust, then the perceived stereotype headline grabbing controversies, they change. So my experience as a teacher showed me that these things aren't just, theoretically possible, but they're actually kind of the norm. When you meet the parents and you hang out together and you talk about their kids, everybody wants kids to get the best quality education. And I take a lot of hope from that.
Yeah, thank you. And I think, Jenny, what you're talking about is the same thing, that the conversation isn't going to be over in an hour. It's part of establishing a relationship. So we've come to the end of our hour. I want to thank all of you for being here, and thank you so much for the work that you do. And NCSC really appreciates it.